Hello, and welcome to my final speech on genetically modified foods. It's often said you are what you eat, but how exactly do you know what you're eating? Well, that's simple. The answer is food labels. Whenever you go to the grocery store and go to make a purchase, one of the first things you do is you flip the food over and you look at the back of it. There's a food label, and it contains information such as calories, fat content, serving size, lots of great information there. But what if I were to tell you that there's something missing off of that food label? Well, there is. And that is whether or not the food contains genetically modified foods. What exactly is a genetically modified food? A genetically modified food is a food that has been changed in a laboratory to be superior to other foods that have not been genetically modified. One of the more popular modifications made to these foods is Bacillus thuringiensis, or BT. It's an insecticide that most farmers will apply to their crops to keep bugs off of it. If the foods are modified with BT, the foods produce BT by themselves, and it keeps farmers from having to purchase the chemicals and apply them. Other popular modifications are modifications to prevent drought resistance, to increase yield, and for herbicide resistance. So what foods are genetically modified? Well, there's many, but the popular ones include soybeans, cotton, corn, and canola. In the United States, in the year 2000, over a quarter of all corn produced and over half of all soybeans produced were genetically modified in one way or another. Now, these numbers represent a sharp increase over the 1990s, as the genetically modified foods were gaining a lot of popularity. The numbers are still increasing, but not at the rate that they used to. So do people know about genetically modified foods? Well, most of them do. 52% know that genetically modified foods are sold in stores. However, only a quarter of everyone thinks that they have actually consumed genetically modified foods. Well, foods that contain these genetically modified foods can include cereal, snack food, soda, baby food, canola oil. The list is extensive. Foods that contain GM foods are everywhere. Over 70% of food on grocery store shelves contain genetically modified foods. What does this mean? Well, there's no way to tell for certain, but practically everybody, 100% of the people, have been exposed to genetically modified foods, as a lot of foods that are popular, sodas, cereal, all contain these. Is genetically modified food safe? The simple answer, we don't know. Starlink corn is genetically modified corn that got into taco shells over on the West Coast. These taco shells that had Starlink corn in them got 20 people ill. Their symptoms range from a swollen tongue all the way up to anaphylactic shock. Well, who tests these foods? The Food and Drug Administration or the FDA? No. See, they claim that they don't have enough time, enough money, or enough resources to test all these genetically modified foods that are flooding the market. There's so many that it's virtually impossible to do all the testing on these foods. So what happens? Well, the FDA has come up with a term called substantially equivalent. What that means is they'll take two foods, one food that is genetically modified and one that is not, and they'll say, are they close enough? Are they substantially equivalent to each other to be safe? Well, the information they get to decide if they're substantially equivalent comes from the companies making the seeds. Of course, these companies aren't going to say, yeah, it's close. Well, they're going to say it's close enough. They're not going to tell you, we don't know. They're not going to tell you they're going to make you sick. So what does this mean? It means that these genetically modified foods are getting to market without any safety or toxicology testing. Nobody knows what's going to happen when you eat these foods. Well, what happens in other parts of the world? I said about how much food is produced here in the United States, but elsewhere in the world, there's over 50 countries that contain 40% of the world's population either require labeling of genetically modified foods or have an all-out ban on them. Countries that require labeling or have bans include Australia, the European Union, Mexico, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Japan, Brazil, Russia. It's extensive. There's a trade agreement signed by the United States. This agreement says that all genetically modified food being exported must be labeled. And anybody importing the genetically modified food has a right to refuse it based solely on the fact that it's genetically modified. So the United States is telling everybody else, hey, this food's been modified. But they're not telling us, the people who live right here. They're not telling us that it might not be safe. But they'll let the rest of the world know. Other concerns include environmental and economic concerns. The environmental impacts, they include, but they're not limited to, gene transfer to non-target species, harm to organisms such as the monarch butterflies, and reduced effectiveness of pesticides. With gene transfer, what happens is plants cross-pollinate. And if a crop has been modified to be Roundup resistant or insecticide resistant, what happens is the pollen from that plant gets onto pollen of other plants. And all of a sudden they become these super weeds. They're virtually impossible to kill because they're herbicide resistant. Also, some other modifications made to the plants, such as insecticide resistance, if they get on plants and the monarch butterflies try to pollinate them, it's killing off the monarch butterflies. Economic impacts. It takes a lot of time and money for these companies to make GM foods. So what they do is they want to ensure that people keep buying their seeds. So what they do is they put what's called a suicide gene in. Many small farmers, for years, for decades, generations back, they always save part of their crop. And they'll take what they save, they'll get the seeds from it, and that will be what they plant next year. These small farmers can't afford to buy seeds year after year after year. Well, when you put these suicide genes into the crops, these small farmers can't do that. And it's putting a lot of them out of business because they can't afford to buy the seeds anymore. And what this does is it widens the gap between the rich and the poor. We have a right to know. We need to know what we're consuming so we can make an informed decision. If we don't know what we're eating, we don't know what's going to happen inside of our bodies. So what can we do about this? When we go to the grocery store, look for words such as organic. Other companies, such as Frito-Lay and Gerber, refuse to use genetically modified foods in their products. So we need to do a little bit of homework before we go grocery shopping. The labels on foods allow consumers to make informed decisions. It's more than just the ingredients in the food, but they are missing one very important piece of information. So genetically modified foods must be labeled. We have a right to know what we're purchasing and what we're eating. And there's far-reaching impacts to genetically modified foods. It's not simply our health, it's also the environment and economics. So please, look for the words organic, be careful what you buy, and be careful with these genetically modified foods, because they don't know what will happen when you continue to eat these.